Hi, everybody, and welcome to what I believe is the third part of our series in of our lecture series in Syrian studies. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce to you today one of the leading scholars. Of Middle Eastern history that really played a major role in politics of cultural heritage and saving the Iraqi North following the Islamic State. But moreover, someone who also played a crucial role in thinking about minorities in modern nation states and empires, and the relationship between rights granted to religious communities and ethnic communities and the development of democracy, democratic cultures, and pluralism more broadly. So there is the sort of borderline cliche that if we introduce the speaker's publication, it will take a year. But I think that in this case, it is true. But let me say a few words about our speaker today, whose name I haven't mentioned, Professor Benjamin Isakhan. So he is a leading professor of international politics and the director of a research network called Police, that is, or Polis rather. Police sounds bad in that context. So Polis, which is a research network for political science and international relations scholars across the world, based on his own home university in Australia. He has been a visiting scholar in most leading institutions in the United States and in Europe, including Stanford, including Penn, including Oxford, the University of Sydney, the University of Johannesburg, and delivered lectures in many top 10 top tier universities in the United States, including the University of Chicago. His research interests include Middle Eastern politics, heritage destruction across the Middle East, which again is very important in the context of the Middle East. And we've already had a chance to think about it in the wonderful talk that Nicholas Algello gave a few weeks ago. Iraqi politics and history, political science, and heritage studies. And he's been awarded for his leadership and for his excellence in studies, a number of awards since 2009 until the recent one, 2021, that was given to him for recent leadership and mentoring award in his own school's Faculty of Arts and Sciences. As I've mentioned before, his books deal and his articles deal with a wide range of topics, including war, occupation, military intervention, the relationship between the Islamic states and the religious and ethnic communities in northern Iraq. What does it mean to engage in cultural cleansing? And as I've said before, also major publications about democracy, pluralism, and the culture of democracy in the Middle East, with a special focus on Syria and Iraq. So we're delighted to have him with us, and we look forward to his talk. Again, we want to thank the generous donation that enabled this talk. And Professor Isakhan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arit. That is a very humbling introduction, a very, very generous one. And I only hope now that I can live up to the extremely generous nature of that introduction. Just bear with me a moment, because I would like to share my screen. And once that's up and running, perhaps, Arit, if you can nod if that looks about right at your end. Does that look right to you? Yes, I can see Kay is giving me a thumbs up, and I'll assume that that's representative of everyone. All right, well, good evening to you, or good morning here in Melbourne, Australia. It's about 9 a.m. here, so I'm up and about and getting ready for the day. It's wonderful to be joining you and to be giving this paper via Zoom. I really wish I could be there in person in Chicago to meet you all, and perhaps to shake hands or have a coffee or go for dinner or something, because I have really great memories of visiting Chicago now it's what we were just reminiscing a moment ago, but it's been about 10 years since I was last there. I'd really like to thank the Centre for Middle East Studies at the University of Chicago and the very generous donors and faculty who have contributed to putting on this seminar series and for inviting me to be part of it. And also just a broader thank you to all of you for making the time out of your busy schedules to participate and to tune into this webinar or Zoom to listen to what I have to say. I'm really grateful for your time, and I hope what I have to say is of interest and of value to you. And I very much look forward to the discussion at the end. And also, you know, I'm always available if anyone wants to reach out afterwards, or if you have a burning question. I'm not hard to find, and I'd be really happy to hear from you. So please do extend a hand out and reach out to me when and if you need to. So let me get started with the formal part of the paper. When the Islamic State seized large swathes of territory across Syria and Iraq and declared their new caliphate, they unleashed a wave of devastating human suffering and unprecedented heritage destruction. In terms of human suffering, the Islamic State undertook mass genocidal pogroms that included the slaughter, enslavement, and forced exodus of thousands of innocent civilians. In terms of heritage destruction, the IS waged an aggressive iconoclastic campaign, targeting some of the region's most sensitive and important cultural heritage sites. Aside from their globally publicised attacks on places like the Mosul Museum and the UNESCO World Heritage Sites of Hatra and Palmyra, the IS also targeted the religious sites of various minority communities. One of those minorities were, of course, the various Christian populations across Iraq and Syria. And the IS, you know, went on a nothing short of a rampage. They destroyed churches, monasteries, shrines, cemeteries, icons, crucifixes, and other Christian religious, historical, and cultural sites. While a number of studies ever since have sought to analyse various aspects of the Islamic State and their iconoclasm, very little today so far has been written examining the impact that this heritage destruction may have had on the different minority communities across Iraq and Syria. And of course, what we're going to do today is focus on the Christian communities as a whole, even though, of course, we remain conscious that there are many complex and nuanced differences between the different Christian communities of Iraq and Syria. So we want to look at their experiences under the Islamic State, their responses to the mass heritage destruction that went on. So to do this, I want to draw on, let's see, okay. So strangely, the slide isn't actually, let's see if this works. So to do this, to sketch this out for us today, I'm going to draw on really what could be called, I guess, a multi-year research program that has been going for over a decade now and includes several different interconnected research projects. I obviously can't go into all of it today, so we're only going to focus on a little bit, but I just thought I would sketch out for you some of the broad parameters of this study, which has been going, as I said, for over a decade now. Firstly, we built a couple of really massive systematic databases of heritage destruction in both Iraq and Syria. In Iraq, we looked at the period from 2003, that is the Iraq War, right through to kind of the end of the formal Islamic State controlling large swathes of territory, and into 2018. And in Syria, we went from 2011 and have collected a huge amount of data about the destruction of heritage sites across Syria during the onset of the civil war right through to more recent times. We also have done 111, it might actually be a little bit higher than that now, in-depth semi-structured interviews with Iraqis and Syrians, including many Christians, And this has involved fieldwork in Iraq, in Jordan and in Lebanon, with Syrian and Iraqi populations living in Jordan and Lebanon, including refugees. And we also have some research assistants working sporadically over this period inside Iraq and Syria. These projects, so there are multiple projects that are interconnected over time, have been funded by a couple of grants from the Australian Research Council, which is our sort of premier research funding national government body here, and the Australian Department of Defence. We also worked with on one of the projects. So as you can imagine, you know, there really isn't time today for me to go into all of the complex data and all of the bits and pieces that have come out of this massive project and all of the different findings. But what I will try to do is to focus on one small aspect and analyse, you know, the Christian heritage sites that have been destroyed, and how out of those interviews, how people understood that, how they reacted to it, how they responded to it, what they thought about it, and so on. So many of the people that we interviewed, including the Christians, come from key enclaves that were attacked, occupied, or threatened by the Islamic State, and where much of the destruction of Christian heritage took place. However, before I go down the kind of empirical material and document that for you, I thought it would be wise to kind of sketch out the broader themes that we looked at in the project, and how we might root that conceptually in the study of heritage and conflict. So heritage, of course, is a deeply contested and inherently political thing. To label something heritage is contentious. What is deemed heritage? Who identifies it as heritage? How is it engaged with? Who engages with it? And how is it revered or celebrated? When is it done so? And more to the point, what are the silences? What are the heritage that we don't acknowledge? What are the heritage sites that we don't acknowledge, or the heritage or the lineages of the past that we ignore or silence? So despite such concerns, for the purposes of this paper, I think we can argue that heritage can be defined as the tangible and intangible connections between the past and the present. These connections may take tangible forms, such as via a monument, a relic, or a national archive, but also they can be transmitted to future generations via intangible forms, such as language, dance, songs, or stories. As such, heritage is vital to community and belonging. It enables individuals to inculcate a sense of shared history and collective identity. Religious heritage, such as tangible structures like mosques or churches, but also intangible practices like specific religious rituals or performances, are thought to be particularly significant, not only because they provide a vehicle in which individuals and communities can connect with the divine, but also because they signal a sense of belonging to a community of the faithful across both temporal and spatial dimensions. However, when conflict erupts within and between communities, heritage sites, and often it is religious heritage sites, can become targets, transformed from locations of belonging and community into places of contestation and conflict. So there has been a whole lot written about heritage and conflict. What is interesting, at least for our purposes today, and I obviously can't go into all of the different aspects of it, but what I did want to focus on, and what I thought is interesting for our purposes, is that there are three key themes that I'd like to focus on today in the extant literature, which I think aren't fully addressed and fully explored, and that require further kind of interrogation. And we can do that through the empirical study of the Christians of Iraq and Syria. So the three key themes that I wanted to look at are these ones here. The first one is how heritage and heritage destruction connects to a sense of genocide, or persecution. So in other words, when heritage sites are destroyed, as part of a broader program of persecution, to what extent do people understand heritage destruction as part of that persecution? And how does it shape and affect their sense of belonging and identity? Investigations into these phenomena achieved perhaps their greatest urgency following the devastating events that tore apart the Balkans in the 1990s. The ethno-religious nature of the war clearly saw the heritage of opposing factions become a direct target. In this context, Andreas Riedelmeier asserted that there was a link between the systematic persecution and expulsion of ethnic and religious communities and the destruction of the cultural and religious heritage associated with those targeted communities. However, the ways in which the persecuted communities of the Balkans experienced this link between heritage destruction and their persecution it isn't adequately explored in the literature, and it's something that I think really kind of needs further interrogation. The second key theme captures this one of displacement and return, captures the fact that very few studies to date have examined the ways in which heritage destruction can serve as a catalyst for displacement and shape experiences of exile. Some studies have documented the deeply contested ways that people displaced by war and conflict, such as those of Rwanda or Sri Lanka, create new heritage sites in exile in order to commemorate the violence and challenge official narratives of the state. Sorry, the narratives of the conflict. For other communities forced to flee their homeland, the creation of new heritage sites can not only commemorate the conflict and suffering, but also capture the trauma of forced migration itself, such as the many sites memorialising the plight of the Vietnamese boat people. However, of these examples, little is understood about the extent to which heritage destruction motivated their displacement in the first place, and the ways in which it has shaped and continues to shape their attitudes to return. And finally, the third key theme that I wanted to look at, reconstruction and reconciliation, demonstrates the fact that really we don't know a great deal about the extent to which and the very problematic relationship between reconstructing heritage and the idea that it might play some role in post-conflict stability and peace building. This is something that's often trumpeted. UNESCO is great at talking about this, but there isn't a great deal of empirical evidence that reconstructing heritage sites actually builds reconciliation and post-conflict peace. In fact, you might even argue that there's a lot of empirical evidence to the contrary. For example, the post-Civil War reconstruction of Beirut has been critiqued for the privileging of renewed commercial and economic activity, appealing mostly to tourists and a few urban elites, over fostering social cohesion and any sense of a return to peace. Similarly, the externally led reconstruction of heritage sites in Mali is said to have further marginalised locals, privileging heritage over addressing extreme poverty and leaving them vulnerable to renewed waves of violence and iconoclasm. So what we find across these divergent contexts is that very little today is known about how persecuted communities experience heritage destruction as a form of genocide, the extent to which heritage destruction shapes their attitudes and actions towards displacement and return, and the role they perceive for heritage reconstruction in developing post-conflict stability and peace. To address these issues, in the remainder of this paper, I want to focus on the case study of the Christians of Syria and Iraq, their persecution at the hands of the Islamic State and the destruction of their heritage, and of course, some of their responses. So this is probably a little bit of the story that's very familiar with you, so I'll just do it quite briefly. But obviously, when the Islamic State began to conquer key territories across Syria and Iraq from 2013 and then into 2014 and onwards, they offered the Christians of the region a very stark ultimatum. Flee your ancient homelands, convert to Islam, remain as second-class citizens, or die by the sword. Hundreds of thousands of Christians fled for their lives. Those who were unable to escape the IS suffered terribly. Many were forcibly converted to Islam. Scores were kidnapped and never heard from again. Untold numbers were tortured or brutally executed by the IS, including by crucifixion. Christian boys were put through religious re-education and military training before being forced to fight as child soldiers. And countless young women and girls were kidnapped and forced into sexual slavery. In addition to the horrific violence undertaken by the IS against the Christian people of Syria and Iraq, they also waged an aggressive iconoclastic campaign to cleanse the region they controlled of any Christian heritage sites. So the scale of heritage destruction as a whole, and then the scale of heritage destruction against Christian sites is way too large to capture in a short talk. But I did want to pause here and just show you a couple of examples, just to, I'm sure many of you have seen some of these images or know a little bit about it, but it's a good way to just reflect on and remind ourselves about the nature and the types of heritage destruction that went on in both Syria and Iraq. So I'll just show you 3 examples from Syria, and I'll show you 3 examples from Iraq, just to kind of capture a very small proportion of the scale of this destruction. So the first example I'll show you is this one here is a Syriac Orthodox church known as St. Mary of the Holy Belt. It's in Homs. The old part of the church, which you can't see in this image, but the original old part of this church dates back to 50 CE. It's making it one of the oldest churches anywhere in the world. The church is thought to be particularly significant because it was believed to have housed a section of a belt worn by Mary. And that, as you can see here, the church was severely damaged, particularly during the extended conflict to oust the Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra from Homs. The entire roof collapsed, furniture was destroyed, bullet holes pockmarked some of the external walls. And as you can see in this part of the church, a lot of it was blackened by fire, rubble lay strewn across the ground and so on. So it's a fairly large-scale destruction and targeting of this church. Here's another one in Deir ez-Zor, Armenian church, which was attacked in September 2014. This is a before and after shot here. This church is known as the Armenian Genocide Memorial Church, and it is believed to have housed one of the world's largest and most significant archives of the Armenian genocide during the First World War, as well as a crypt that included a lot of human remains of victims of the genocide. As you can see here, the IS did a great deal, the IS and Jabhat al-Nusra did a great deal of damage here. They put explosives inside the site and then detonated them, and you can see the scale of the destruction that's gone on, which is quite remarkable. In February 2015, the IS captured a string of villages along the Khabur River in northern Syria, displacing about 7,000 people and taking about 270 captive. They literally went on a rampage of heritage destruction, setting fire or destroying or damaging pretty much all of the churches, if not all of the churches in these villages. They were basically appeared to be determined to erase any vestige of Christian life in the area. For example, on Easter Sunday in the village of Tal Nasri, they blew up the Assyrian Church of the Virgin Mary, which they reduced to rubble. As they went on to do at many churches, they also set booby traps and landmines around the site in the hope of killing Christians as they returned to their homes and to their churches and tried to rebuild their life. So that's a couple of sort of seminal examples, I guess, from Syria to indicate the scale and nature of the destruction. I'll give you a couple of examples from Iraq as well, just to remind us all about what went on there. This is the St. George Monastery just outside of Mosul. In December 2014, the IS took over the site. It's a Chaldean Catholic site which dates back to the 10th century. They in fact used this church as a makeshift prison where they detained many, we don't know the precise number, but perhaps up to 100 female prisoners that had been captured by the Islamic State and went on to be used as sex slaves. So this became a sort of a prison for them to keep these women that they'd taken prisoner. So, you know, obviously a terrible turn of events there. They also removed crosses, smashed the altar and various religious icons, desecrated gravestones, sprayed jihadist slogans and anti-Christian graffiti on the walls. And as you can see, the structure itself suffered massively. Several principal parts of the building, such as the entire walls and most of the roof, had collapsed. Gravestones were desecrated and smashed, and the perimeter's walls were partially destroyed. So great deal of damage here. Similar damage occurred across the Nineveh Plains. They're sort of very densely populated by Christian communities across the Nineveh Plains. This is in Karakosh or Bakhtida, Al-Hamdaniya, depending on how you want to name it, Iraq's largest predominantly Christian town, which was attacked from July 2014. Here's one example in the town that was built in the 4th century, the Syriac Catholic monastery. It's believed to have had intricate carvings and decorations and housed a valuable Christian library and archive. As you can see here, the IS pretty much completely destroyed the site. They rigged explosives around several of the key structures, including key shrines. And this is a sort of before and after. So this is the before, and then here's the sort of after of parts of the site that have been, as you can see, more or less completely reduced to rubble. And finally, in the mixed Yazidi and Christian villages of Bashaka and Bazani, the IS not only destroyed virtually all the Yazidi sites in the 2 villages, they also damaged Christian cultural property as well. For example, the 19th century Assyrian St. George Church and its adjacent cemetery, which you can see in this picture, suffered extensive damage. At the church, the IS defaced icons, damaged altars, removed crosses. They also used the interior of the church as a rifle range. So they set up a number of targets at one end of the church and then would practice their aim and practice their shooting at these targets from inside the church, obviously doing a lot of damage. So we can see that the site has been pretty heavily damaged. The ceiling was partly collapsed, all the furniture had been removed, walls have been vandalised, and every symbol of Christianity and the cross and so on had been removed and destroyed. And as you can see here, this is the adjacent cemetery where the IS defaced Christian gravestones and smashed open tombs in the hope of finding valuables and money. And they left it in this state with human remains exposed, I guess, to the elements. So it's a extremely sad and terrifying and disappointing sequence of events across Syria and Iraq, and I've just tried to capture sort of the spirit of that and the intent of that in these 3 examples from each country to give you and to remind us all about the scale of what went on and the destruction. So this human suffering and heritage destruction that the Christians of Syria and Iraq experienced under the Islamic State poses for us a series of important questions. How have these communities interpreted this destruction? And to what extent has it shaped their experiences of our 3 key themes that we are looking into today? Genocide and belonging, displacement and return, and reconstruction and reconciliation. So let's go through them sort of one at a time and look at examples for them. So in terms of our first key theme, genocide and belonging, it's not surprising that several respondents commented on their sense of loss and trauma at the destruction of Christian heritage sites. For many, the destruction was viewed as an integral component of the broader genocidal campaign undertaken by the IS against the myriad Christian people of the region. One interviewee, an Assyrian from Mosul, provided a detailed account of the links between the destruction of heritage and the persecution of the Christian people. So here's a quote from this particular interview. This person argues, it is a genocide, heritage destruction is a genocide, because genocide is not only killing you, but a genocide is also by removing your identity. So when your foundation is removed, it is a genocide too. They didn't have the chance to kill you, so they removed your culture, they removed your identity, they removed your churches. Those things are the foundation of the people. If they remove them, you have been removed. So key to understanding quotes like this and the complex ways in which people interpret heritage destruction as part of their persecution is the fact that these Christian heritage sites across Syria and Iraq played a really important role in the community and in their sense of identity and belonging. For many respondents, the churches, excuse me, the churches were much more than sites of religious instruction and ritual. They were also significant hubs for social gatherings, communal solidarity, and cultural practice. The destruction of Christian heritage sites across Syria and Iraq therefore had profound consequences for the respondents, for the interviewees, and for their sense of belonging and identity. One Armenian we interviewed from Aleppo put it this way: when there are targeted attacks on churches, they are trying to destroy, to take from people the sense of belonging. Because when you go to church, you belong to that church. But when you destroy that church, you are destroying the relationship between you and that church and the sense of belonging. So for me, this is really important in expanding our sort of understanding of heritage and conflict, because it indicates that that there are intimate ways in which heritage destruction is connected to broader sense of persecution and a broader rupturing of belonging and identity. So what I also wanted to look at was our second key theme of displacement and return. Not surprisingly, the respondents also identified the complex relationship between the destruction of Christian heritage sites and the role that that had played in their sense of exile and in the prospects of them ever returning. Several interviewees argued that the destruction of Christian heritage had in fact been a key catalyst in their decision to leave their traditional homelands, as they felt that nothing was left to keep them in the region. So putting it really succinctly, one of the interviewees stated that when people saw that the churches were being destroyed and schools were being destroyed, they said, yes, it's time to move out. For others, the destruction of heritage sites had not only been a key motive to flee Syria and Iraq, but was also one reason why they might never return. As a Syrian woman from Dohuk explained, when I saw that they damaged everything, I cannot describe. We should not say it, but we are feeling that whatever happens to Mosul, we do not care anymore because they destroyed everything there. Why is it necessary for people to return back to Mosul? You can build again houses, you can build again schools, you can make people go back, but what can we do without these heritage places? So this, I think, is also a really interesting kind of theme and finding and thing we need to know more about. That not only that heritage destruction can be understood as genocide, can be related to a fracturing of a sense of belonging and identity, but also that it can motivate exile, motivate displacement. That people, when they see their heritage sites destroyed, take that as a sign, as a broader sign that it's time to get out. But more to the point, that once those sites have been destroyed, it does raise questions about why would I return? If what it means to be a Christian, for example, in Syria or Iraq, is to be in a neighborhood or in an environment or in a city or town, not only where there are Christian sites, but where those sites are respected and upheld as important, that's one thing. But when those sites are destroyed, why would you return? What role does heritage play in that sense of exile and return? I think is a really important question. That arguably faces diasporas and post-conflict communities all over the world, not just Iraqi and Syrians. So the third and final theme is around reconstruction and reconciliation. While heritage destruction had motivated some respondents to flee their ancestral homelands and led others to conclude that they might never return, it had also led some to consider a third key theme, namely the role that the reconstruction of heritage sites may come to play in fostering intercommunal reconciliation and post-conflict peace building. Some pointed out that it would do little good to rebuild the Christian sites if there were no people or no Christian people left to utilise them. One Greek Orthodox interviewee from Aleppo reflected on his experiences of having witnessed the reconstruction of several churches in Homs, despite the absence of a significant Christian community. He recounted it this way, which I think is really illuminating. He said, most of the churches in Homs have now managed to be rehabilitated or restored. But if you go nearby, you'll see that they demolished completely entire neighborhoods and buildings. Therefore, the Christians can't go back. So now we have restored the buildings, but we do not have the living stones, the community. What good are old stones, heritage sites, if you do not have living stones? What does it mean to have heritage but nobody to pass by those heritage? What does it mean now to pass by ruins where you don't have human beings? If you lose the human beings, nothing remains, in my opinion. So this, I think, sort of connects to what we were saying a moment ago about how heritage and heritage destruction shapes attitudes of return. Also, this kind of idea that, you know, even reconstructing heritage sites in post-conflict environments doesn't necessarily rebuild that sense of belonging and identity, because, you know, if the broader context is one where, okay, so you have these heritage sites, you have these old stones, as this person says, but you don't have that sense of community, or you don't have a community at all, then what good is it to restore and reconstruct heritage sites across post-conflict environments? And I think this is a really important question facing the international community, is these massive projects to rebuild and reconstruct heritage sites in Mosul, for example, a big UNESCO project. One of the key questions is, okay, so you rebuild all of these heritage sites, but so what? If the people and the communities aren't there to, for example, the Christian communities with the churches that are being rebuilt in Mosul, if they're not there to connect with them, and if they don't feel a sense of belonging and identity, and if heritage destruction shapes their exile and their attitudes to return, then what role will it play if you rebuild these? And is that the most important sort of use of resources in this context? And maybe it is, I'm just putting the question out there. However, this same respondent also thought that the very process of Syrians and Iraqis rebuilding their heritage together could in fact be an antidote to intercommunal tension, an effective way of fostering dialogue, promoting peace, and rebuilding trust between communities. So this person, same person, put it as such: rebuilding the heritage should not be done by one sector, by one ethnic or religious group. It should be by the whole Syrian people, because it will contribute to bring people together again, as it has contributed in the past, to bring people and to bring different nations together, to come and to contribute to intercultural relationships and connections. So this, I think, is really important in this context, because twofold. One, a lot of the post-conflict heritage reconstruction in Syria and Iraq and globally is done by international actors, not by domestic actors. And where it is done by domestic actors, it is quite often done, not always, not exclusively, but often done by particular ethnic or religious groups. But what this person is saying is that if you really want to rebuild the complex mosaic of people and cultures that was Syria and Iraq before these conflicts, then maybe how these things ought to be done is by a broader consensus, by a broader working together of these communities to rebuild each other's heritage. And that this can play a role in bringing people together and in fostering these relationships, intercultural relationships and connections, as this person puts it. All right, I will just offer some thoughts by way of a conclusion. So despite the volume of literature on heritage and conflict, only a handful of studies have documented how people who have been displaced by conflict or witnessed the destruction of their heritage experience this destruction, the ways in which it shapes their displacement, or their efforts to reconstruct and reclaim their heritage towards a more peaceful future. This paper has therefore addressed this lacuna by focusing on the case study of the myriad Christian communities of Syria and Iraq, documenting the results of in-depth semi-structured interviews with Christian men and women from across the two countries. The interviews reveal that for these Christians at least, the IS attacks on their heritage sites had occurred along three specific but interconnected themes. First, many respondents reported experienced the heritage destruction done by the Islamic State against Christian sites as a key component of the broader genocide. It triggered a distinct and profound sense of loss and trauma at the hands of the Islamic State, which in turn ruptured their sense of belonging. Second, for many interlocutors, the destruction of Christian heritage was a key catalyst in their decision to flee their homes, leading to physical and emotional displacement. For some, heritage destruction also diminished the prospect of returning to their traditional homelands, with several wondering why they would return if their most sacred heritage sites had been destroyed. Third, the respondents also held complex views on reconstruction and the role that it could play in post-conflict reconciliation. Some wondered who would use the sites given the mass exodus of Christians, while others longed to rebuild, seeing heritage reconstruction as a vital way to restore social cohesion and to heal the wounds left by war and division. These three key themes therefore have implications beyond the case study of the Christian people of contemporary Syria and Iraq, advancing our understanding of the complex relationships between heritage destruction and genocide, displacement and reconciliation in conflict. Indeed, engaging with local opinion on heritage, its destruction and reconstruction is perhaps the only way that efforts to protect and restore heritage can have a meaningful long-term impact in complex post-conflict environments. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take some questions if we have time, and see how we go from there. And I'll stop my screen if I can work that out. There.
Thank you so much. So the floor is open to questions. And the recording will be on Facebook. There was a question that was asked there. So I was wondering, since so there's a question saying, considering the political instability of Syria and Iraq, would it make sense to even think about reconstructing the heritage?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. I don't disagree with that at all. I think there are really big problems in reconstructing heritage sites in these kind of immediate post-conflict environments, not least of which is that you can actually exacerbate conflict and cause new waves of violence. And you can also greatly frustrate and anger locals by privileging heritage sites over broader humanitarian needs. And that certainly comes out of the study and the interviews that we've done. A lot of people across Syria and Iraq are saying, you know, it's crazy spending millions of dollars reconstructing an old mosque that I never went to, or an old archaeological site that I didn't even know was there, when, you know, we don't have food, we don't have water, we don't have electricity, where there are all kinds of health, education, other systemic problems. But, you know, having said that, I think heritage is important to community. It is important to rebuilding a sense of identity and purpose. They are symbolic sites that provide inspiration, I guess, and also opportunities for spiritual growth, personal growth, and learning about history and so on. So it is a complex balancing act, and there isn't one right, one size fits all model. My sort of critique would be that the way to get there and the way to do that well is to engage more substantively with local populations in the process. And this would be my sort of ongoing critique of for example, the UNESCO project in Mosul, the big, you know, Revive the Spirit of Mosul, is that it's probably really underdone the consultation with local people in the rebuilding and reconstruction, and that, you know, runs all kinds of risks, including, as I said, exacerbating conflict, annoying people, undermining, privileging heritage over people and communities, and so on.
So you have a couple of questions at the chat if you want to.
Okay, let me try.
So I'll start by summarizing Aiden's question that says that you're dealing with like Christian sites that are destroyed by sort of religious zealots or fanatics like ISIS. But what is ISIS' obsession with pre-Islamic heritage, right? Because they're also destroying, as she points out, pre-Christian sites as well. So where's the obsession there?
Yeah, absolutely. There's sort of pre-monotheistic iconoclasm was a really big part of what the Islamic State did across both Iraq and Syria. You can see this in, Palmyra, for example, Nimrud, various archaeological sites. Also the Mosul Museum, where they destroyed a lot of pre-monotheistic ancient Mesopotamian relics and artifacts and so on. This is not disconnected from their broader iconoclastic campaign. I think there are different motives driving different types of heritage destruction at different times. It's a bit, I want to be careful about being reductive and say, well, this type of destruction is motivated by this particular ideology or set of principles, because the Islamic State itself doesn't have a consistent permanent sense of ideology and principles that guides all of its actions. Plus, you're dealing with a very asymmetric, conflict and set of scenarios that are not easily distilled down to sort of basic principles and formula. But certainly, with the pre-Islamic stuff, you would argue that there isn't a contemporary people that engage with and privilege that those archaeological sites and pre-monotheistic sites to the extent that there are with more contemporary or more recent religious sites and monotheistic sites. So Shiite sites, for example, were targeted, Yazidi sites, Christian sites, various different ethnic and religious communities, their sites were targeted. So there are different motivations there. I think there's definitely a cleansing of the sort of polytheistic nature of pre-monotheism and all of those sites, and that definitely drove a lot of that destruction. And they talk about that very openly. There's heaps of quotes, heaps of videos, heaps of material in Dabiq and so on in all their propaganda that talks very openly about the reason to target polytheistic or even sacrilegious sites that portray the human form and stuff like that. When you get to kind of Christian sites, Yazidi sites, Shiite sites, it is much more connected, although it is partly about that, partly about cleansing alternatives to Islam. I think it is also driven by a targeting of the people themselves, that it's about a symbolic targeting of Christian people. And so you want to destroy their heritage sites to also send a message to them as communities that they're no longer welcome under the kind of monolithic Islamic State.
So can I follow up on that? So I was wondering if you can describe a little bit like the sort of landscape of heritage politics right now, at least in northern Iraq, because from what I understand, there are like amazing local initiatives of communities here in the United States, historians and others who go there and work with librarians and sites. So that's one element. Then you have folks from the Gulf who wanted to reconstruct like the Jonah mosque and shrine. Then you have the Iraqi state, then you have sort of the Kurdish authority. So how does it work in this kind of mix up of all these powers that have very different visions about what needs to be renovated and what needs to be renovated first?
Yeah, absolutely. And the answer probably to that is that it doesn't work, that is the problem. That is a huge issue, that there are a number of competing factions. You've mentioned some of them. Another big one is the Shiite militias and their sort of Iranian backing, which are going into what, in some cases, going into what were formerly Christian towns and building Shiite shrines, for example, to recreate a sense of them being, or to imagine a sense of them having been Shiite cities and towns all along. So there is a complex array, as with everything in Iraqi politics. So you can take the kind of cultural heritage landscape as a microcosm of the broader political landscape, and argue that there are a number of factions all vying and competing for sort of control of heritage, which reflect their broader ambitions, their broader interests in the region. And so you obviously have Kurds funding different initiatives of some, for example, of some Christian reconstruction projects. You have a number of local projects. You have a number of projects funded directly by the US, for example, and other Western interests. You have a number of UNESCO-led projects. You have a number of projects led by the Iraqi state, as you mentioned. And all doing different types of work, all having sort of competing agendas, all viewing cultural heritage, I guess, as a soft power influence in the region and a way to kind of consolidate and build their legitimacy and their interests. And all pulling in different directions, and it's a really complex and you mentioned the Gulf as well. The Gulf has been one of the big backers and has been very heavily critiqued, in fact, for its kind of backing of cultural heritage projects, not just in Iraq but across the region. And so there are a really complex set of dynamics that underpin that, and you're right to point it out. I don't have a kind of one simple answer to outline how complex that is. It just heritage has become a weapon in a broader sort of ideological and political war between a mosaic of different factions. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. That was really interesting. You have two more questions at the chat. Ramon is asking you about a counterpoint. Any thoughts about justice and reconciliation aspects of Syria and Iraq concerning rebuilding this cultural heritage and religious sites? And then you have a question from Michael. Thank you for this insightful thought and appreciating your comments on genocide violence. But the question is more about the Assyrians' responses and representation in Iraq. They identified violence with ISIS as singular, but what about the sort of pre-ISIS period? What about 2003? And then we'll go to Nicholas, who also has a question. So first these two, and then we'll move to Nicholas.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rich, and thank you, Ramon and Michael, for these really insightful questions. They're very valuable. So I'll deal with Ramon's first. Absolutely. I think I did mention very briefly in the project that, UNESCO and various other actors are very big on selling the idea that heritage and heritage reconstruction is a vehicle for peace. And to the extent, forthcoming paper, I'm talking about this with a collaborator of mine, talking about the ways in which a significant global norm has emerged around this idea that operates at every level. You can go through and see various statements coming out from the UN Security Council, from the EU, from all kinds of international global actors, from state actors, about the idea that heritage protection and heritage reconstruction implicitly fosters peace, that there's something about it that will automatically trigger processes of peace and reconciliation. However, when you go through the sort of empirical examples and you study the empirical examples of this, it's actually doesn't really stand up to any kind of empirical scrutiny. There have been times and places in which heritage reconstruction could be argued to have played a positive role in reconciliation and post-conflict stabilisation, but actually it just as often doesn't work out that way. So if you look at, for example, in Mostar, the rebuilding of the bridge after the Balkans conflict, it was paraded by UNESCO as a significant achievement and a major pathway to peace. The bridge itself was supposed to be a symbol of uniting the two different parts of the city and so on. But really the city and the people remain divided, and those divisions remain deeply entrenched, and a sort of, there is a sort of simmering ongoing tension, I guess. Similarly in Mali, the post-conflict reconstruction of many sites there that were targeted during periods of conflict have also, really in some instances, argued to sort of exacerbate conflict and actually increase tensions between communities, and also increase a kind of broader criticism of UNESCO and of international actors who are so fond on reconstructing sites but do very little, to stem violence and to stem tensions between communities. And I mean, I think there's a big question hanging over Mosul. It really is a huge question that UNESCO and others are pouring millions and millions of dollars into these massive reconstruction projects, but the extent to which they are going to tangibly connect to post-conflict reconciliation remains really difficult to interpret for me. And the idea that you rebuild something like the Great Mosque of al-Nusri or the Al-Habda minaret in Mosul and click your fingers and everyone returns to peace because they're nice images, really, I think, it is very problematic. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done. But I don't think we should we should necessarily equate post-conflict heritage reconstruction to peace building. It doesn't always and only work out that way. So thank you. It's a very important question. The other one was about, okay, so we've done all these interviews with Christian communities, and have they kind of identified, have they focused purely on Islamic State as the perpetrators of violence and that Islamic State period, or are there do the interviewees reflect on these broader trends that go back to the 2003 war? Absolutely is the answer to that question. Not only do they go back to the 2003 war, but there's also many interviewees across the ethnic and religious groups that we've spoken to who also talk about earlier historical periods, including under the Ba'ath, and the persecution, the kind of Arabization that went on across northern Iraq, the persecution and discrimination against ethnic and religious minorities, the ways in which that really was, the 2003 war was really a trigger point for that to escalate into sort of live violence between different communities, and the dramatic escalation in violence and persecution of minority communities, and also day-to-day levels of discrimination. Like, people talked about things like, when I went to enroll at university, I wasn't able to put Assyrian as my ethnic identity. I had to write Arab, and that was deeply offensive to me because I've always understood myself to be ethnically an Assyrian person, not an Arab person. So there's all kinds of complex and nuanced ways in which violence and discrimination worked against religious and ethnic communities in Iraq over time, and they're all reflected in the interviews. Having said that, the project is really about the post-2003 and then the Islamic State periods, which are the key kind of focuses of the data.
So there's an interesting question here that Nicola posed. So we're often accustomed to think about genocide as a function of state violence. For example, Nazi Germany targeted extermination of Jews and Slavs, or the cleansing of Assyrians and Armenians, Christians in the Ottoman Empire. But does genocide as a formal concept potentially obscure rather than clarify the particular dynamics of mass violence as perpetuated by sub-state actors? In the context of the Middle Eastern countries and with relatively weak centralized state institutions, Lebanon being the quoted example, to what extent does intercommunal violence facilitate or undermine state legitimacy or cohesion? So that's to the poli-sci side of you.
Yeah, thanks, Nicholas. Nice, easy question. We could pretty much write a thesis on that. I think that's really important, though, a really important observation. Yeah, absolutely. I think that traditionally we've understood genocide as being the hallmark of the state, but the increasing recognition around non-state actors and both the intent and the execution of genocide has been increasingly recognised, and certainly that's the case with the Islamic State. There are a number of different initiatives ongoing that have sought to quantify, because to make the kind of legal claim for genocide, it's not a simple sort of process. There are very specific sets of definitions and criteria that a movement or actor needs to meet, or a state in that instance. And there are a number of ongoing number of ongoing initiatives by various different actors to catalogue the extent of the genocide and the extent to which it meets all of the criteria of genocide. I encourage you to look those up. There's whole heaps of different stuff being done, focusing on different communities. So it's pretty much established that they both intended to and did execute war crimes and genocide against communities like the Yazidis, the Christians and Shiites across Iraq and Syria. And you can go through and catalogue that. It's certainly something if you want to email me, we can talk more about, and I can point you in the direction of some of the material that I've looked at. And the second part of the question was, there are kind of these Middle Eastern states that have relatively weak centralised state institutions, and to what extent does intercommunal violence facilitate or undermine state legitimacy or cohesion? Absolutely. So, we know the literature is very strong on this, that, where you have weak centralised states and you have these large, powerful non-state actors, Lebanon's one, Iraq's one, there's a whole heap of them across the Middle East, that they do undermine state legitimacy and cohesion, and they undermine that on multiple different levels because they're quite powerful non-state actors that deliberately set out to mimic, in some cases deliberately set out to mimic the state, to provide the kind of services both at an ideological and at a physical level that the state is supposed to provide. We know this, for example, there are heaps of examples, but Hezbollah is probably held up as the seminal example of a non-state actor that has created a state within a state, and that is arguably as powerful as the Lebanese state itself. So, there are heaps of them. There are heaps of them in Iraq, a whole complex array of different. You only have to look at Sadrist movements over time to see the scale and the power that they've achieved, right up to basically being kingmakers now in the Iraqi parliament, because of the scale and size of their non-state actor, of them as a non-state actor, and their own legitimacy. The extent to which they draw legitimacy from their constituents is arguably more powerful than any other political actor. So, yeah, it's a real problem, absolutely. But I'm happy to talk more to you about that. If you want to reach out, we can have a conversation about that.
So there's another question from Raina asking about what do you think the steps that should now be taken to combat the long-term consequences of this destruction to the collective identity and memory of the Syrian people. Not only local communities, but those communities in the diaspora continue to struggle to access their heritage and preserve their heritage. So, and I think this is a very opportune moment because you're talking to one such diasporic community in Chicago.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for the question. Yeah, I think there isn't probably one single bit of advice that I could give that maybe all of you hadn't already thought through. But I do think that it's incredibly important. I'm of a Syrian background myself. And, we are a large diasporic community across the world, and our culture and our language and our history are fading globally, and that it is really important that we, as a community, do what we can to preserve elements of that over time, both in the traditional homelands of the Assyrian people in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere, but also in the diaspora. And, things like this are a great initiative, coming together and allowing presentations from different people interested in the Assyrians or of Assyrian background, certainly recording, cataloguing things like language and culture and traditions, intangible and tangible heritage, and doing what we can across the diaspora. We're not dissimilar to all diasporas in the sense that there's a complex relationship to home and there's a complex relationship to memory and heritage that we can only continue to be vigilant to work to preserve and protect over time. And so I encourage you and everyone to pursue that when and how you can, with the resources that we have, and the time that we have.
Any more questions? But can I ask a historical question? So, what was
Sure.
learned, for example, and you touched on this in your talk. On the one hand, this is the sort of the proportions here of the destructions are quite um, horrific. We haven't seen something like the Islamic State in many years. But at
Mm,
the same time, there is a long history, as you've mentioned in your talk, of Beirut and other places
mm,
that experience this kind of cultural heritage building. There are communities right now, I think the Armenians are the most prominent, that kind of are very active in sort of creating kind of a new museum culture. Hegner
mm.
Wattenpohl has been very influential in debates about sort of appropriation of cultural product. So, has something been learned from, let's say, heritage reconstruction efforts in the past? Is there any reconstruction effort that is used as a model that people say this is successful? We want to emulate something like that, because there are a lot of unsuccessful projects. Is there something in the history that is kind of inspirational or that gives hope to future endeavors?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are many different heritage reconstruction projects that have occurred in the developing world, but also, across Europe, for example, after World War II, there's heaps of them, and many of them are held up as kind of iconic examples. Warsaw is one of them, but there's many. Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to UNESCO, if we're to focus purely on UNESCO, UNESCO is a big, complicated institution, global multilateral institution, that is kind of hamstrung by the politics and complex, political processes that underpin how it operates, and to a very real extent, my view of how UNESCO operates is, I guess, that they feel that there is a kind of a standard model that you kind of roll out in post-conflict environments, and that they have this kind of ironically, kind of zealous belief in the power of heritage to cure conflict, right? It's actually the founding principle of UNESCO. If you go back to its original documents, peace in the minds of men and all that kind of stuff, really what they have talked about and what they've believed from day one. It's a very kind of Eurocentric, post-Enlightenment view of the world, that all you have to do is sort of educate people and build heritage sites or reconstruct heritage sites, and that whole cultures and societies will transform into these kind of liberal, egalitarian, peaceful, utopian future that they imagine for the world, right? And that really, if you read Lynn Meskel, someone who I've collaborated with a lot, wrote a book a couple of years ago on UNESCO. It's called A Future in Ruins, UNESCO and the Quest for Peace. It's a fantastic book if anyone wants to look it up. And in that, she talks a lot about this, that this is really the driving principle of UNESCO, this sort of fundamentalist view, in a way, that heritage and heritage reconstruction can do anything. It basically is the cure for these post-conflict societies. And if there's conflict and division, the answer is more heritage. More heritage, the better. And look, I don't disagree that heritage can play a role. I think heritage is vitally important to community, to people, to identity, and that it absolutely needs to be part of the equation. But it's not magical. It doesn't do everything. It's not a panacea. It won't cure conflict in and of itself. It needs to be done in a sensitive and engaged way. It needs a broad-based consensus from the local population. It needs to be to make sure that they have agency in the process, that they're involved in every level. It can't just be a top-down rollout of expertise. It really needs to be a much more nuanced and engaged process than what we see. So yeah, there's a very complex history to it all and to all their efforts. There isn't one model that I'd hold up as the example, but I would problematize the idea that the sort of UNESCO's founding mission really remains adequate in the complex dynamics that tear apart something like Iraq. And you spoke a moment ago about how complex heritage is in northern Iraq. And, you know, the idea that UNESCO can kind of roll in, you know, it reminds me a lot of the sort of Bush campaign and the idea to bring democracy to Iraq, right? It's the same kind of thing. You just roll in and say, well, we're going to host elections and everything will work out after that. UNESCO, I mean, it's going a bit far to equate UNESCO to the Bush administration, but they do have a similar idea that you can roll in and rebuild everything and everything else will work out and take care of itself, you know. Heritage first, everything else second is the UNESCO kind of idea, you know, and I think that's really problematic in something like Iraq.
Yep. Okay, any further questions? Last chance. Okay, so this will be available on our Facebook page, the CMS Facebook page. So if you guys want to share it, repost it, we'd be very happy. And we want to thank again profoundly Professor Isakhan for taking the time, his morning time for him to chatting with us about his research projects. And we hope to see you in person next year or in the future. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Centre and to the University for hosting this, and thank you to Arit and Thomas for organising and chairing it. Thank you.
Thanks.